Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather as the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Métis, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory, thank you. This territory was part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Treaty, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and then the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, this meeting place of TEDxToronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you on this territory today. So why do I acknowledge this territory? Why do I say these words? Well, almost exactly 1 year ago today, exactly 1 year ago, it's amazing, I was living and working inside of a war zone. The war zone was probably something like you might imagine. There was razor wire demarking boundaries where you dare not step. If you do, you're met by armed police, decked out in riot gear, guns and shields, their face masks with balaclavas. There's a constant feeling of threat. It feels heavy, and over time it made me feel slightly paranoid. There were militarized checkpoints where army tanks are parked. If you try and pass, you're questioned by guards holding weapons. Your movements are tracked, and you're always aware that at any moment you could be detained and questioned. There's the constant and pervasive sound of surveillance planes and helicopters. This is probably the thing that I remember the most. The endless hovering of aircraft, morning and night, always present. It's a sound I never got used to. And then there were the floodlights, shining white light down through the night. Imagine a dozen full moons shining down at you, all around you, and they're accompanied by snipers, lurking in the shadows, trained to kill, always watching you. And then there were the people. The people living on the front lines and in the camps. Rows upon rows of tents and shelters where men and women, strangers, families, friends, they slept side by side. It was a small village. Medical tents, schools, kitchens, multiple kitchens where mass meals were served. There was camaraderie and accountability. We survived through the help of one another, and this connected us vitally. And you might think I'm describing a conflict zone in Syria or Gaza, or really any of the war zones we see reported. But I didn't have to go so far to be in this war zone. The place I'm describing was inside the United States of America, Standing Rock, North Dakota, to be exact. It could have been anywhere. It could have just as easily been here. I'd arrived there to document the 9-month-long standoff that saw unarmed civilians occupying land in protest of the Dakota Access Pipeline, a large-scale pipeline project that would cut across 4 states and threaten the drinking supply of millions. Originally, the pipeline had been set to be built near the state capitol, but when people took offense to the possible environmental harm it would cause, they lobbied to have the pipeline rerouted. And just like that, the pipeline was moved to within half a mile of the Standing Rock Sioux Indian Reservation, moved without consultation with the tribe or proper environmental assessments done. And just like that, the repeat button of history was pressed. The repeat button was pressed. When settlers first came to North America, they employed many tools to extract control over the land and, by extension, the first peoples who lived there. The fur trade and the gold rush are just 2 examples of industry that would use the land in the service of progress. Indigenous women were attacked through acts of violence and forced marriage in order to procure land ownership, and buffalo, which once roamed free in the thousands, were mass slaughtered. They were an important food source to Indigenous people, but when they were mass slaughtered, they induced a famine, and they induced dependency, and they forced relocation, thus freeing the land again for settlement. And then there were residential schools, which separated children from their parents and their communities. These were state-led tactics to decimate Indigenous spirituality and culture. So time and time again, we've learned the lessons about the value of land, the meaning of Indigenous lives, and the language that connects them both. At Standing Rock, we had state-sanctioned armed forces standing in retaliation against unarmed civilians, all in order to protect the corporate interests of a private company. No one expected that a few dozen Native people would balloon into tens of thousands to make this the largest Indigenous-led protest in over a century. Who would have thought that people occupying land peacefully would incite so much force? I spent months in and out of Standing Rock, documenting the occupation there. And I could share many things with you because I saw many instances of beauty. But today there is one particular memory that I'd like to share with you. I was filming on a crisp day in November when the warriors of the camp were called to the front lines. The construction crews were advancing quickly, and we were being called to stop them from crossing a small river. Tensions were high, and the media was beginning to take notice of what was happening in Standing Rock. People from the camp rushed to the water, and they waded out into it to form a line to face the riot police who stood on a hill above them, looking down at them. And the police, they stared back at us. They rarely looked at you. It was more like they were looking through you. Never direct eye contact, just the imposing threat of their bodies clad in armor, their weapons in hand, ready. And one woman, she stood just kind of beside me, and she began to sing. She was beautiful. She was standing there in waist-deep water, cold water, and she was singing. And she was mid-song when suddenly she stopped. And she pointed her finger straight out at the police officer in front of her, and she looked him straight in the eye, and she said, "I see you, and I see you see me." She held his eye. He kept trying to look away, but his eyes, they just kept coming back to her. And she held him there. She held him in that space. And then she began to sing. She began to sing to him, holding his gaze. And she sang as the enforcement started spraying tear gas into the faces of the protesters. A white cloud of smoke overtook the crowd, and the police officer she was singing to, he broke rank, and he yelled out to her, "Run, please, run, save yourself." But the woman, she just stood there as they gassed her at point-blank range, her body a weapon of protest. And what I witnessed in that moment, it was a rare moment of connectivity. An officer disarmed by a singing woman emboldened because she had been seen. Two people recognizing each other's humanity in a moment of violence. One doing his job as an officer sent to protect the interests of an oil company. The other, an Indigenous woman, fulfilling her traditional role as a waterkeeper there to protect the river. The land that holds their bodies connects them. Their language connects them. And their recognition of one another connects them. In that moment of violence, there was actually harmony within the dissonance. And so when I stand before you on this stage and I acknowledge the land of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Métis, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, I'm acknowledging our shared humanity, our connection to one another. I'm also acknowledging decades upon decades of colonization that has sought to control, own, and destroy our relationship to this land. And not just my relationship as an Indigenous person, but your relationship too. When I acknowledge the land, I do so in a language that is not my people's. And this might seem like a small detail. However, I believe that the erasure of Indigenous language is key to why we are where we are today. You cannot separate our languages from the land. Language is the connective tissue that allows our relationships to flourish and evolve. Erasing the way we communicate affects how we relate to everything around us. And First Nations people have always operated within an oral culture. Our culture and traditions are passed down through storytelling, and our stories, they embrace a worldview where the natural world, both human and non-human, is a relative. And when you see your relatives all around you, how can you enact harm in that which you love? So my Indigenous language, it's derived from the land. And it's through listening that we came to know the names of things. When our children are born into this world, we wait for them to show us their names. And more often than not, a word will suggest a relational meaning. For example, the Ojibwe word for wind is nudin, and nudin means three things. It means the wind blows, it is windy, and there is wind. The human relationship to wind is inherent in its meaning. It does not exist alone. We are present in its meaning, existing only in relation to everything else. It's a delicate balance. So when you hurt the land, you hurt yourself. I wanted to take the time to speak with you today, to speak aloud these ideas, because I really believe that words have power. And the ideas that I present to you, they're not new. They are not my own. They're as old as the rock we come from and as far-reaching as the four directions. They're shaped by the ancestors that have come before. When we acknowledge our history, we hold space for all of our relations. We make room. We cultivate a relationship with the earth, and we can become stewards of the land that we're meant to be. And when we listen, we can foster hope and understanding. We can foster peace. I don't speak my language. Nobody in my family does anymore. But I learned these words to bring them here to you today. Kakina ginwit, et sheek minashtodan, kakina gegwa kandaguk. Be gentle with all things of nature, for everyone. Chimigwech.